Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public, which is a series from Columbia Climate School. I'm Sarah Wagner. I'm a master's student at the Climate and Society program at the Climate School, and I'm also the graduate assistant of the K12 and continuing education, also at the Climate School, and I'll be facilitating the session today, welcoming you all here. I'm joined by Laurel Zaimashihi, who's the Assistant Director of K12 and Continuing Education, and I'm so looking forward to talking with Joan Lopez, the Program Manager at the Climate School's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, otherwise known as AC4, for this week's session titled Architectures of Peace, Linking Sustainability, Security, and Stability. Hi. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Climate School or joining us for the first time, we did want to share a really quick introduction. So the Climate School was founded in July 2020. It's Columbia University's first new school in 25 years, and it's dedicated to advancing transdisciplinary climate research. As a hub for innovative climate solutions, the Climate School brings together experts from across fields to address the most pressing climate challenges of our time. The Columbia Climate School is committed to shaping future leaders to drive climate solutions forward in every sector by offering educational programs for degree-seeking students, high school students, teachers, professional learners, and the public. By equipping changemakers with knowledge and skills, the Climate School empowers stakeholders in the fight for a just, prosperous society on a healthy planet. So what we're hoping to do with these Climate Live K12 sessions is to introduce you all to our interdisciplinary work through our experts. These monthly sessions run through the academic year from November to June, and this is our fourth session, I believe. Each session focuses on a certain topic and is directed at a certain age range. This year, we also have a special series called Young Leaders in Action that focuses on the actions and successes of young people that are leading the way in climate action and driving change in their own communities. We've featured 2 high school students working on climate action in their community already. Our April session also features another young leader. And we have a few other upcoming sessions, including Threading the Needle, Tackling Microplastic Pollution from Clothing, which is in March, and the role of blue carbon in combating climate change and restoring biodiversity in May. So if you want any more information about any of those sessions, you can visit our website and check out our past sessions, which are on the Climate School's YouTube page. And I can drop both those links into the chat so you have access to those, both past and future. But for now, I'm honored to turn it over to our expert today. Joan works at AC4 on developing qualitative and quantitative methods to evaluate the impact of youth community leaders. He studies the threshold where socio-political processes led by youth community leaders meet with the production of peace in areas experiencing conflict. So he focuses on understanding the ways youth leaders make sense of violent conflicts and how they construct practices and technologies to respond peacefully to these conflicts. He is also interested in how the concrete practices designed by community youth leaders can inform and further develop academic approaches to peace building, conflict resolution, leadership, and also on how the work of youth leaders can benefit from applying some of the practices and theories from academia. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please use the Q&A box. The chat is disabled, but we want to make sure that we get all your questions answered at the end of the presentation. And finally, the session is being recorded, so we will send all participants a link for the recording after it's complete. With that said, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Sarah, for such a wonderful presentation. And thank you to the people that are attending this session. So I will begin with telling you what has been my central interest. As Sarah mentioned, my interest for the past 10 years has been in understanding the internal logics of youth organizations, particularly in Colombia, in Medellin, Colombia, a country that has experienced 70 plus years of internal conflict, violent conflict. And I've been interested to understand how youth community leaders organize to respond in peaceful ways to such conflict, specifically in urban settings, so very particularly in the city of Medellin. And from that exploration, I have been able to understand aesthetic representations of what we called resistance to violence, linguistic representations, and other everyday practices that these youth community leaders have produced along the years in responding to the violent conflict. And in the past couple of years, as I write a doctoral dissertation, I've become more interested with the relationship between human beings in general who live in areas with protected conflict, violent conflict, and the actual environment, the natural environment. So I've become more interested in architecture and in infrastructure, right? And uh, a lot of my interest comes from a professor at Barnard who is an architect, but that does a lot of ethnographic work on urban planning specifically. Her name is Hiba Bau Akabar, who perhaps some of you know, and she has done a lot of work in Beirut. So some of my work, what I'm going to share with you today, comes from my reading and my studying of her work. So I am going to share my screen. Let's see. Give me a moment, please. For some reason, Sarah, I'm not being able to share my screen.
I am a panelist as well. Laurel, I think that you were the host. Can you enable that? Because I have the same accesses as you.
I think I got it.
Got it?
Can you see?
Amazing.
Okay,
Perfect.
wonderful. Okay, so this is an bird eye look of the city of Medellin in the northeast comuna of the city, or the northeast communities or neighborhoods of the city. And these communities were constructed in the middle of a violent conflict, right? And so what I'm looking at is in what ways have people constructed these communities as a way to hide from violent conflicts, right? For the most part, the people that inhabit these areas have been displaced from other parts of the country. And my interest becomes then an interest particularly in urban spaces, right? So of course, the urban space is the ultimate construction of humans in the natural environment, but that doesn't mean that there are not natural spaces within urban settings. And so I look at the interaction between the two. So let's begin with the guiding questions, some of the guiding questions for this conversation. And I begin with making a historicity, if you want, of the view of the relations between culture and nature, right? So my question is, how does the environment, the natural environment, and also the built environment intersect or interact with other systems of power, right? How does politics enter into play in the construction of built environments within natural environments, war, discourses on peace, on peacemaking, right? And economics, of course, and other systems of power. How do they intersect or interact? The other question that I ask is, how are built environments, particularly in urban spaces, are produced at the intersection of war and peace building, right? So, and so the picture that I just sent you, that I just showed you, precisely depicts that, right? How have people built their homes, their streets, their schools, their recreational spaces in the middle of a war with the hope of peace, right? So how are those narratives, those hopes imprinted in infrastructure and in architecture ultimately, right? And as I said before, this work comes from my reading, or partly my reading of Bauwakar's ethnography in Beirut, Lebanon, right? And she particularly has a book that tackles the making of Beirut's frontiers around popular discourses on sectarianism and this idea of a war yet to come, right? So how do you build spaces within cities with this anxiety in a moment of peace, but with this anxiety that there is a war yet to come, right? So the idea of future, the urban planning in what she calls the urban frontiers of Beirut are very much influenced by this anxiety of a war yet to come. So this is a map of Medellin, the city where I work in Colombia. And I show you this to go back to this question of systems of power interacting with our built environments. And so the first photo that I showed you, it's San Javier or Comuna 13 here in the bottom. And this is a pathway from central Colombia towards the ocean, towards the Gulf of Urabá, this place between Panama and Colombia. And this becomes a strategic place because it's a pathway for merchandise from the south of Colombia, legitimate merchandise from the south of Colombia towards the north, towards the ocean, but also illegal commodities, cocaine, arms, people, you name it, right? And so this part then has become very, very contested by the state, of course, but also by illegal armed actors or irregular armed actors, such as paramilitary groups, criminal gangs, guerrillas, militias, etc. Right. So geography matters. It's the question here. This is more of a zoom-in picture of this sector of the city, right? So these houses, as you see, have been built. Some people called informally, other name them organically. But the fact is that they have been built in a process of people arriving from rural areas into Medellin, escaping violence, but finding urban violence in their arrival places in Medellin. And these houses have been constructed always with the anxiety of protecting your livelihood from the urban conflict, right? So I've been looking at in what ways can we read the dynamics of a conflict not only from the everyday social practices such as aesthetic representations, linguistic representations, my past work, but from infrastructure, from the materiality of life, if you will. This is another picture of this sector more zoomed in, and this was taken right after a military operation in 2002, in which the national government, because of alleged presence of guerrilla movements within this zone, sent the military with Hawk helicopters and also terrestrial military groups to take over the community. And the response of this community in interaction with their infrastructure was to send a message to the government of a ceasefire. Okay, so in the social sciences, we believe there's a tendency within the social sciences that believe that the social-natural world is constructed, is culturally constructed, is historically constructed. There is no such thing as nature without the social and the cultural aspect, right? With our ideas of nature depending on the geography of the world in which you have grown up, you start to construct an idea of nature that is very specific, right? So objectively, the idea is that there is no such thing as nature. There is always an interaction between culture and nature. And so the making of a sociocultural world is created through this complex of relationships between the biophysical, right? Well, we could say objectively, quote unquote, the physical world, and human domain, which accounts for particular configurations of nature and culture, of society and nature, of place and landscape, and ultimately is lived in and deeply and becomes deeply historical, a historical entity, right? So nature has to be understood then as a historical entity that has been produced. There are at least four approaches to this nature-culture relationship that the social scientists have been influenced along the years. So between the 50s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, the tendency was that the approaches taken were from the perspective of seeing the complexity of this relationship in terms of adaptations between humans and the environment. Right? So humans would simply adapt to the environment, and the environment was this objective thing that did not have any effect. People didn't act, if you will. Now, as we moved from the 60s toward the 70s, there is the emergence of a dialectical view to this. And this posits that the relationship between organisms and the environment, and organisms being human beings and the environment, according to which each shape and produce the other through a continuous interaction, right? So in this case, the environment also acts on human beings, and dialectically, we produce built environments and we produce inhabitable places. Then we have moved more towards an adaptation approach, and the idea here is that this is a more encompassing concept that entails biological, social, and political process, and all of this is mediated by culture, and that's how we understand the relationship between nature and culture. And today, there is almost a synthesis between all of these, where culture, nature are treated as fully historical and constructed, right? You don't have an absolute or an objective human being or cultural entity and an objective natural environment, but they are always in synthesis, adapting each other, feeding off each other. And the sociocultural worlds become then the result of human action, even if conditioned by particular environments. That's sort of the history of how social scientists have understood this relationship between nature and culture. So now the practical matter, right? What I came to tell you today has to do with how to do research, how to investigate this relationship, looking particularly at spatial practices, right? So the explorations here, the central question is, are the explorations of how territory, urban territory, but otherwise, you could look at suburban territory as well, may be arranged by practices and discourses of fear, rumor of conflict, and talk of war, right? It is taken by Wakar's book, For the War Yet to Come, right? So how people construct ideas, construct discourses, narratives, very much touched and very much influenced by anxieties of fear, of conflict, of war, and how then territory is imagined and arranged and planned towards the future. I have developed this concept that I've called the geographies of peace building. And this comes from very specific understandings of maps, or very specific understandings of the relationship between maps, realities, and narratives, right? So maps can be physical, and we use them to navigate the physical world, but they come from the construction of mental maps, right? And these mental maps are the result of narratives, of what we say about the world. Right? So these are these maps, these narratives that humans construct of a kind of people and a kind of things exist in the world. When you take a physical map, you really don't see the totality of the people or of the things that the map wants to show you. And the approach that I have taken in doing ethnography has to shed light or to bring attention to those things that are not seen, that are not captured by physical maps, right? And the premises of the construction of maps generally is that we depend on our mental maps to navigate the world, right? And they help us navigate and classify reality, right? And then mental maps assign, not only do they allow us to classify and to navigate reality, but they also allow us to assign meaning to what has been classified, right? And so in cities like New York City, we assign certain kinds of meanings to specific territories, to specific neighborhoods, right? We assign meanings of class, we assign meanings of race, we sometimes assign meanings of gender, of political tendencies, of beauty, etc., right? And so like that, we construct mental maps, and from those mental maps, we construct physical maps that we then use to navigate cities and the world more generally, right? So there are things that exist that are not part of our mental maps, and that's our role as ethnographers, especially if we're looking to bring attention to those areas of cities that have been silenced historically and that for the most part have been victims of conflicts. And this leads us then into an ontological problem: what exists and what does not, and then how do we shed light, how do we write about all these things. And some of the questions that I have utilized with working through participatory action research in the field with community leaders, especially youth community leaders, have some of the questions that I utilize in my workshops and in my overall ethnography have to do with how do people who have lived in the middle of a war understand peace, what narratives come out of that, um, what are their peaceful responses to the violent conflicts, and how lately my question has been how do they construct their houses, their roads, their schools, etc., around responding peacefully or protecting themselves from a war yet to come, to utilize Babu Akur's um, terminology. So this is now as a picture of the same area that overlooks almost the entire city of Medellin, right? And as you see, there is a very interesting interaction between nature, what we call nature, and infrastructure, right? So I'm utilizing all of these pictures to patch them together and comprehend in what ways, what are these architectures telling us about people's everyday practices seeking peace in a city like Medellin. And what I've found, which I call infrastructures of peace and of healing, is that for the most part, these houses, these buildings, the cemeteries within have representations not of the war, not of the war, but of the way people are healing from the negative effects of a war. And there are some pictures here for you to look at from the Central Cemetery of La America, it's called, in which community leaders have come together to paint their memories, to make their memories material, if you will, as a way of collective healing. Those are the two pictures on the right. The one on the left has to do with the commodification of healing. So the making of products for the sake of selling them, especially to tourists, about the narratives of the conflict and a little bit about the narratives of the peaceful responses to such conflict. So with this, I end my presentation, and now I am open to questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction to your work. That was my first introduction to this idea of infrastructure and cultures interaction. So I have a lot of questions for you, but I will remind all of our participants, we do have the Q&A open and we'd love to answer your questions. So please do put any thoughts that are coming to mind there. In the meantime, if it's okay with you, could I ask a couple of my own questions? I'm curious, you mentioned that you were working using participatory action research, and I'm wondering if you could speak more about that process.
Yes, so the participatory action research is a school of research that understands human subjects, as we call it call them in academia, as not objects of research, but more active subjects of research. And so the knowledge that is produced, it's done in collaboration and with the participation of the people with whom you work in the field. So a piece of writing, it's done with the approval and with the ideas that come out of the people that with whom who have actually showed you around. Um, so that's one part of it. And the next one has to do with action, so that the knowledge produced is not only for the sake of knowledge and for academic purposes, but for the purpose of taking action about the findings that you produce. And
Mhm.
you do that in a participatory way.
Could you speak about one of your most recent projects that sort of had that back and forth bi-directional piece to it?
Well, there is in Medellin um, a network, a historical network of peace builders.
Mhm.
But it's very fractured, right? It sort of started to become a reality during the 60s when the conflict started, and it has developed until today. But lately, because of a participatory budgeting that the city of Medellin made effect, which is that some people have access to the city budget to make projects in their communities. There is this battle against those resources by different community leaders, and that fractured this network of peace builders. And so, in my research, working with different people and different groups, one of the findings was that we needed to construct a platform, if you will, in which this fabric of peace builders was to be rebuilt, right?
Mhm.
So to highlight that indeed it's important to sort of get resources from the municipality, but that it's more important to recuperate the historical memory of that peace building fabric that was built. So that I think it's a very quick example of how these things are done.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I will also thank Terry for your question. I'll read it to you. This is such an interesting question, actually. Does this tie in with migration by many people fleeing their countries related to violence and for other reasons?
Yeah, so the latest, so as you on those pictures that you saw, most of those communities were built on the 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But those hills are higher, and the new buildings that you see in this place are from Venezuelan migrants that are arriving into Colombia because of the political situation and economical situation in Venezuela. And one thing that I've started to look at is in what ways are the recipient communities that have similar circumstances are being welcoming or not, what new configurations of conflict emerge from migrants, but also in what ways do people collaborate in this movement. And there's people doing things of this nature in the border between the US and Mexico, in the border between Mexico and Guatemala, some places in the south of Europe. Um, but yeah, this does touch upon the issue of migration, to be sure.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I imagine that, groups of people with different experiences would inform how then the group that they come into contact with then starts to understand their own experience.
Exactly.
I have one more question for you, and then we're good to go. We're already over time, but um, you showed us that picture of the poster that said "En la trece something la violencia," which made me think about the like community building. And I'm curious if you've found any ways that constructing these spaces of peace or resistance have also resulted in creating spaces of community, or how that connects.
So, doing a little bit of work in Palermo, in the south of Italy, and talking with the mayor who was able to resist the mafia in that city. He has this concept of community building is peace building, right? It's or peace building, it's community building. So there is a necessary connection between the two. So when people come together to resolve their everyday issues or to safeguard life in a moment, as I was explaining with this military operation, not only are they thinking about safeguarding life, but they're also thinking about a friendship. So in one publication that I have, in a participatory action research way, we with my friends there developed this idea of friendship as being a powerful component of conflict resolution, of peace building, but ultimately of community building, right? So in these processes, what is more important besides safeguarding life is to produce friendships and communities that care among each other.
Thank you for that answer. I would love to read that publication. That is really beautiful. All right, we will stop it there. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, Joan especially, and we hope that you have a good evening.